and thank you all for being here. I'm Gloria Palmer, the Executive Director of Green Mountain Academy for Lifelong Learning. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, I would like to extend some thank yous. First to Burn Burton Academy for allowing us to use the theater and for their assistance with technical equipment. Secondly, gnat-tv videotapes several of our lectures, which they then provide for us to use on our website and to the community at large on their local access stations. We are grateful to them for this service. I am delighted and frankly quite honored to introduce our speaker. Following the 1979 revolution in Iran, Mansour Farhang served as an advisor to the Iranian Foreign Ministry and as ambassador to the United Nations. He resigned his ambassadorship in protest when his efforts to negotiate the release of the American hostages in Tehran failed. In the early months of the Iran-Iraq War, he worked with international mediators to settle the war. During this period, he wrote and spoke about the threat of religious extremists who had come to dominate the course of the Iranian Revolution. In June of 1981, following the violent suppression of political dissidents, he was forced to leave Iran. In the fall of 1981, he returned to the United States and became a research fellow and lecturer at Princeton University. Since 1983, he has been teaching international relations and Middle Eastern politics at Bennington College in Vermont. He is the author of 2 books and dozens of articles in English and Persian, published in both academic journals and popular periodicals. His opinion pieces have appeared in various newspapers, including the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, and the Christian Science Monitor. Currently, he is close to finishing a manuscript entitled Theology and Power, Reflections on the Iranian Revolution. He serves on the advisory board of Human Rights Watch Middle East and is a member of the Columbia University Middle Eastern Seminar. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mansour Farhang.
Thank you so much, Gloria. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it's a special privilege to address an audience such as yours about a topic which is very complicated and doesn't lend itself to simple explanations. And we all know that. That's one advantage of aging and becoming a senior citizen, that we become familiar with complexities of life. I'm going to spend some time, a little of my time, on the background information with respect to why this issue is important, Iran's nuclear issue, not only with respect to Iran, but also in regard to the challenge and problem of nuclear proliferation in the world we live in, and then devote most of the time to the latter part of my presentation dealing with the recent developments and some of the challenges and difficulties this interim agreement faces, both in the United States, in Iran, as well as other countries. As we see the map of Iran, the country, in Iran we refer to it as a cat. It's the head of the cat is there, and it's surrounded by both Persian Gulf and the Caspian Sea, a number of states with most of whom Iran has complicated relationship. Now, before going on, I wish to say a few words that you don't really need to hear this, just as a background reminder about nuclear arms, that the invention of the nuclear arms and in what sense nuclear weapons have really changed the nature of possible warfare in the world. The term mutual assured destruction, or MAD strategy, which happens to be called MAD, it really represents the reality that nuclear weapons are fundamentally and qualitatively different from other weapons human animals have invented from time immemorial, in the sense that it is an instrument of collective suicide. It is not an instrument to be used against an enemy, hoping that you have the superior power, but literally, given the number of nuclear weapons in the world and the fact that the nuclear weapons states have the capacity to hit each other, it's really the mad strategy, and an instrument of collective suicide is an accurate description of the nuclear weapons. And therefore, many countries in the beginning, when the United States used it first, and the United States was able to use it in Japan, and the only country in the world that had nuclear weapons, the possibility of retaliation didn't exist. But now, when we talk about second strike capability, it means nuclear weapons are ready to be fired from the air, from the bombers, from the land base, as well as from submarines. So even when country A is hit with nuclear weapons, that country, without being hit or at the same time that it's being targeted, it could retaliate. That is, the destruction is very mutual and very much at the same time. So as a result of this, new terms were developed in international relations to explain this reality. And this became deterrent or containment. That is, you have the nuclear weapon in order to deter the temptation of being attacked by others. Otherwise, the country, at least no country in the world today, is in the position of wanting to use nuclear weapon as an offensive first use weapon. So, nuclear details. And here, as a result of this invention, the countries with nuclear weapons, they decided to establish a treaty, which is the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It was in 1970 that the 5 countries at the time, the recognition of 5 nuclear weapons states, as we know them, at the time, the Soviet Union, the United States, Great Britain, France, and China. And this Non-Proliferation Treaty had 3 purposes, or 3 principles. One was the preventing other countries from giving them encouragement and incentives with respect to their defense and security, so they will not pursue nuclear weapons, that is non-proliferation. The second purpose was disarmament, that the countries with nuclear weapons commit themselves to engage in gradual disarmament of the nuclear warheads, and then the right to peaceful use of nuclear technology. This was an incentive for other countries that if they sign the treaty, commit themselves not to pursue nuclear weapons, they will have the right and they will get assistance in order to develop nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. And they created at the time International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, in order to monitor the implementation of this treaty. And Iran signed this treaty in 1971-72 and received assistance at the time from the United States, from France, this is under the Shah, and also from Israel to develop nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. When the Siemens of Germany was contracted to build the Boucher nuclear reactor, which later on the contract was annulled, and also France was going to provide nuclear enrichment technology to Iran. And Israel at the time had a good relationship with the Shah, and they were building a factory in Qazvin, Iran, for actually delivery system and missiles that at the time it didn't have a nuclear weapons purpose, but it could be used for the purposes of nuclear warhead. Then the revolution came, and in Iran there was a genuine and real revolution. 35 years ago, when I used the word revolution, I had a kind of romantic and positive view of revolution. It's not the way the word revolution is used in commercials. Revolutionary lipstick, revolutionary hairdo, revolutionary this or that. Always, particularly in the United States, the word revolution has a kind of romantic and positive connotation. This was also the case with respect to political sense in much of the Third World. The French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Soviet Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, and also the world was being. But now if you ask me after what I witnessed in Iran and after I studied what had actually happened in most revolutions, it's at least the connotation to me is no longer as romantic, as positive as it used to be, particularly in a political sense. So when the revolution came and Ayatollah Khomeini, this is so ironic because Ayatollah Khomeini was so categorically opposed to anything the Shah had done that he thought the nuclear energy in Iran was actually a treacherous act. So they completely shut down the Bushehr reactor. They annulled the contracts with Siemens of Germany, as well as the French nuclear enrichment company. And not only that, they went beyond that. They arrested the Iranian foreign minister, Abbas Khalafari, and accused him of committing an act of treason for signing the treaty with the French in order to get technology for enrichment, and signing an agreement with Siemens of Germany for building the nuclear reactor in Bushehr, which now the regime, as we see it today, they went through a metamorphosis. They committed an incredible criminal act, executing this man. And recently I wrote an article for a website of Middle East experts, and I even found the newspaper at the time. In the spring of 1971, the newspaper that published the picture of Mr. Khalafari and with the headline, the accusations. 4 years later, during the Iran-Iraq war, particularly after Iraq used chemical weapons against Iranians, and the world didn't seem to care, and it was obviously against the law, against international norms at the time, Iran decided to revive the nuclear program in 1984 and 85. And here, because Iran had taken hostages, the war was going on, sanctions were imposed on Iran, Iran was isolated politically, so they contacted countries like Pakistan, like North Korea, China, and any other country that was willing to sell nuclear technology to Iran, openly or in the black market. I remember that 3 countries did not sign Non-Proliferation Treaty: India, Pakistan, and Israel. All 3 are today nuclear weapons states. 1 country, North Korea, signed the treaty, but the treaty itself has a provision that any signatory to this treaty can withdraw its signature with a 90-day notice. And this is what the Koreans did. They cheated, and they finally ended up to withdraw from the treaty. So today we have actually 9 nuclear weapons in the state. There are many other countries, at least 14 or 15 of them, that have the capacity to make nuclear weapons if they want to, but it is not in their security interest to do so. So here, from the very beginning, there was suspicion against what Iran is doing, given the behavior of the Iranian regime, both internally as well as regionally. So the International Atomic Energy Agency in late 80s and early 90s, they started raising questions about Iran and asking for inspection of Iran nuclear facilities. And the longer they went on, the more questions they had. And finally, in 2002, 2003, it was discovered that Iran actually had secret nuclear facilities for enrichment. Then the enrichment of uranium is not necessarily against the commitment of the signatories to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, because the peaceful use of nuclear energy could imply also producing the fuel you need for your reactor. However, the word enrichment is not at all used in the treaty. And I will get back to this later on because it's an important point of contention between. So finally, that the Iranians' nuclear file was referred to the United Nations. When it went to, I have to say that the only country that really confronted Iran in a real sense and took specific measures to pressure Iran was the United States, even though it went to the Security Council and other members, permanent members of the Security Council cooperated, and also the governing board of the International Atomic Energy Agency also cooperated, but the only country that had the capacity to put economic pressure on Iran through secondary units, both direct sanctions as well as secondary sanctions, was the United States of America. So the pressure continued. So Iran became politically isolated. Even all options on the table, the military threat against continuation of Iran's nuclear program was raised by both President Bush, George W. Bush, as well as President Clinton did it, George Bush did it, and of course Obama. So the sanctions became incredibly effective in the sense that Iran had, for about 7-8 years, $700 billion worth of oil revenues. Today, Iran is exporting about 700,000 or 800,000 barrels of oil a day, and even cannot collect the money for what it sells because of sanctions on banking and the financial transaction. And there is a wonderful, very informed article in today's Wall Street Journal by David Cohen, who is the Undersecretary of State for Terrorism, and he's in charge of implementing these sanctions. It's really a very informed article for those of you interested. So for a decade, there was fruitless negotiations with the permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany. And here I have to say that the reason that the sanctions have become far more effective over the past 4 years than in the previous 8 years during the Bush administration was that the Bush administration was not interested in negotiating with Iran. The Bush administration, particularly after the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, the idea was the regime change in Iran. It was assumed that sooner or later what they did in Afghanistan and Iraq could also be done in Iran. And most European countries, as well as China and Russia, they were completely opposed to it. And as time went on and these invasions did not result in what was expected, however, in 2003, George Bush gave an incredible gift of all time to the Iranians. Iran had two enemies: Taliban in Afghanistan because of the Shi'i-Sunni conflict. They were virtually at war, and Saddam Hussein, who was the enemy of Iran. And Iran's insecurity was completely focused on these two countries, East and West. West Iraq, East Afghanistan. And George Bush came and overthrew both of those regimes and installed two regimes which are very close to Iran, particularly in Iraq. When George Bush said God had instructed him to invade Iraq, the only country that completely agreed with him was the Islamic Republic of Iran. And if you listen to the Friday prayers, the day after George Bush made that statement, they said, God works in mysterious ways, even though George Bush was supposed to represent the great Satan, but God had used the great Satan to get rid of Iran's enemies. This is the way God operated. I don't know any other country or leader that openly said George Bush might not know what he was doing, but God was using him in order to get rid of it. And this was really part of it. It blew my mind when I heard the Friday prayers in Tehran and Kerman and the rest to actually use, they said, here is proof. And then at the same time, they closely cooperated with the United States in the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. to the extent that American military commanders and naval commanders in the Persian Gulf thanked the Iranians for the assistance they gave them in invading Iraq. The first organized military force that entered Iraq after the American troops was 12,000 Iraqi troops trained and equipped by Iranians. They entered the country through the southern part. So at that time, Iran was really afraid and weak, and they wanted to negotiate. They sent a letter through the Swiss embassy to directly negotiate with the United States, but George Bush categorically rejected their proposal and referred to them as part of the axis of evil. What it did was that the European countries did not want to cooperate with the United States. Neither did Russia or China, because assisting the United States with respect to pressuring Iran could end up in another war in the region, and they didn't want that. When Obama came, the first thing he did, he sent a letter to Ayatollah Khamenei of Iran, the supreme leader of Iran, which in my opinion was an incredibly clever and intelligent act. And he said, let's get together bilaterally, negotiate without any precondition. The Iranians at the time didn't respond, but the impact of this letter on the European countries, on Russia and on China, is that this man is not interested in war. This man wants to use sanctions or economic, political isolation of Iran as a way of bringing Iran to the negotiating table. They cooperated. It was the cooperation of the European Union, as well as China and Russia. The UN Security Council passed 6 resolutions sanctioning Iran. Why? Because they were convinced that Obama was interested in a negotiated settlement and not invasion and another war in the region. So in the Obama initiative led to, as I will explain, so they're all together the evolving issues of the Iranian nuclear dispute. In the negotiations, they dealt with legal issues. Is Iran living up to its commitments to the Non-Proliferation Treaty? Security. Is Iran threatening to other countries in the region, ideologically or through assistance to subversive elements or acts of terrorism? To what it became also a political issue, both inside Iran as well as in the United States, that it became a domestic issue. The factionalism in politics in Iran is rampant, and the nuclear issue became very political within Iranian body politic and then technical. To what extent the centrifuges? Where is Iran getting the centrifuges? Is Iran actually developing its own technology? Are they getting advanced centrifuges, and to what extent and how quickly they can enrich uranium? Not only, for purposes of providing fuel for Iran's nuclear reactor, but also leaving 20% up to 90%, which is necessary for bombing. So as a result of this, I would say the new prospect for is that the new prospect? No. Okay, new prospects for. Now here I would say President Obama's policy of wanting to negotiate with Iran without precondition, as I explained, receiving assistance of European countries. And then Iran has, it's an autocratic state. It's a theocratic state, and there is no other state like Iran in the world. It is the first modern theocracy. And then they have provided, even though the clerics really are at the top of the political hierarchy, but they have also established something that, to the best of my knowledge as a student of comparative politics, teaching it and studying it all my life, there is no other country that has this particular method of providing election, in the sense they have totally undemocratic but competitive elections. That is to say, for the office of presidency, only those who are completely committed to the state, to the theocratic order, they can run, and then they go through a vetting process, but nevertheless at the end, 3 or 4 or 2 or 5 candidates, whether for parliament or for the presidency, are running for office. Even though there have been cheating a couple of times, fraud, particularly in the re-election of Ahmadinejad. But I would say over the past 34 years, most of the elections in Iran were undemocratic but competitive. And when it's competitive, the candidates, and everybody can vote, even though most Iranians cannot run, because in my opinion, and survey research shows, most Iranians do not at all identify with the regime. They are not, if they have secular orientation, they're opposed to theocracy, they're opposed to mixing of religion with politics and all that, they're completely disqualified. And yet anyone who runs in order to get votes, they could end up taking a kind of critical position toward the status quo that attracts voters. Khatami, Mohammad Khatami did it in about 12 years ago, so did Rouhani. And Rouhani is a very educated man. He's a lawyer. He has a PhD in international relations from a British university. He has written extensively. And I have read everything he has written. And the best way I can describe his personality, in fact, as I did in a particular article, he's a kind of Islamic Henry Kissinger, in the sense that he really knows power politics. He knows equations of power. And yet he is totally disinterested in normative issues. In his writings, you read Henry Kissinger, he's a brilliant man when it comes to political analysis and equations of power, whilst he is completely disinterested in human rights, completely disinterested in the quality of government in a country that may or may not serve American purposes. So in that sense, he is a power-oriented individual. What is in the best interest of the regime from the perspective of power, equations of power, and power challenge to the regime. He's not an ideological, he's not a fanatical thinker, even though he's within the regime and operates within the parameters of the regime. So his election, but it's not only him, but sanctions persuaded the totality of the regime, including the top officials, that it is in their interest to negotiate. It is in the interest to come to the negotiating table. It wasn't a decision based and motivated by the national interest of the Iranian people, by the welfare, security, and humanity of the Iranian people, not at all. They made the decision. They thought it is in the best interest of the regime because the sanctions are suffocating the regime and making the gap between the people and the regime deeper and deeper. So both the Obama initiative and then the election of Rouhani led to this agreement, the Geneva Agreement of November 24. Now, this agreement, it's a compromised interim accord. And it means that the P5+1, that is 5 permanent members of the Security Council as well as Germany, they made some very limited concessions to Iran. Again, if you ask me, the United States made the concessions because the United States is really the principal force behind the sanctions. And yet, because the United States wanted to internationalize the issue, they sent it from the International Atomic Energy Agency to the Security Council, and the Security Council passed half a dozen resolutions against Iran. So from a legal point of view, the issue is international. But from the realistic point of view, the issue is between Tehran and Washington. And yet the Washington has to be very careful to keep the international importance of this issue, that if there is ever time to take military action or to expand sanctions against Iran, the United States will receive support from other countries. So they made some, they said Iran can enrich, engage in enrichment of uranium up to 5%, 3.5% to 5%, because it is necessary to provide fuel for Iran's nuclear reactor. And also they gave Iran sanctions relief of about $7 to $8 billion. It's Iran's own money, which will be, Iran will be able to withdraw from it gradually over the next 6 months as it lives up to its obligation. Very limited. Really, they're insignificant in comparison with the incredible sanctions imposed on Iranian banking and trade relations. And Iran's concession to the 5+1 or Washington, that is, capping Iran's nuclear program with strong verification measures. Today, Iran has massive enriched uranium up to 3.5% to 5%. I think up to probably, I don't know exactly how much, but it's very extensive. And Iran has up to about 200 kilograms of enriched uranium at 20%. That could easily be expanded to 90%, which is necessary for bomb making. And it's very interesting that in 2003, when Iranians were virtually desperately appealing to the Bush administration for negotiation, Iran had only 1,500 centrifuges for enrichment of uranium. Today, Iran has close to 20,000 centrifuges. That, in other words, while economic sanctions really hurt the Iranian economy, particularly the Iranian people, it did not have a negative impact on the advancement of Iran's nuclear capability and nuclear technology, which is really paradoxical. If sanctions were intended in order to prevent Iran from gaining the capacity to make nuclear weapons, it did not do that at all in the past, while really hurting the economy and creating immense political problems for Iran with respect to the demands and expectations of the society. And also Iran capping Iran's nuclear program with strong verifications and diluting the 200 kilograms of 20 enriched uranium to 5%, that it will not be, that is diluting it, that it will not be, that Iran will not be able to expand, to continue the enrichment beyond 20%. And also, so there is also a heavy water reactor in Iraq, a city in southwestern Iran. That work on it has to be completely suspended. And also, in the centrifuges, Iran cannot make more centrifuges, and the number of centrifuges they can use for the 5% enrichment of uranium has to be limited. And Iran has committed itself to give unconditional, unrestricted, daily permission to International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors to go to 2 or 3 facilities where nuclear is enriched. So Iran has given serious concessions. Now, it's supposed to be within the next 6 months that this interim agreement is supposed to be finalized. And it depends on whether, if Iran lives up to its commitments with respect to capping its enrichment of uranium, limiting its nuclear activities, putting an end to Iraq reactor. If over the next 6 months, inspectors of International Atomic Energy Agency verify that Iran is actually living up to its commitments, it's not violating it, then it's really paving the way toward a resolution. And the resolution really, what does that mean? It means the level of enrichment of uranium in Iran, whether they have an agreement for a period of 5 years or 10 years, it has to be negotiated. That they make a commitment not to enrich uranium beyond a certain level, 3.5% to 5%, and the amount of enriched uranium also has to be completely limited. And the centrifuges they use, the number of centrifuges they use, they have already committed themselves not to expand them, and the number has to remain limited. And then the control of enriched, what the existing enriched uranium has to be under the control of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and they will monitor what is being used. Even the Boucher reactor is not completely operational. When it becomes operational, the fuel that is used for the Boucher reactor, International Atomic Energy inspectors have to be monitoring that. And again, number of active centrifuges, and when that happens, timing and priorities of lifting economic sanctions. After 6 months, then in a very gradual step-by-step process, if Iran satisfies the concerns of the 5+1, the concerns of the International Atomic Energy Agency, sanctions against Iran will begin to be lifted. Now, what in my getting away from the technical issue, revolutions, as most of us know, wherever they happened, let's say a number of classic revolutions, American Revolution, French Revolution, Soviet Revolution, Chinese Revolution, Cuban Revolution, Iranian Revolution, they have always demonstrated a tendency to export their idea, to say that what we have created here is so fantastic that it can be exported to other countries. Napoleon tried to do that. It ended up in water. In the United States, this expansion was largely continental. And even to this day, we are talking about American exceptionalism, export, nation building. That tendency, because the American Revolution is the most successful revolution of all, it's that tendency of exporting it. To me, the nation building, the United States going to Iraq, and nation building and all that, it's a delusional idea that comes from that revolutionary spirit, and the tendency that if we have destructive power, which the United States has beyond all imagination, destructive power is not necessarily useful to create anything. Iraq would be destroyed in a few days. But building a school in Iraq, building a hospital in Iraq, creating any kind of coalition in Iraq, bombing cannot do that. So the Chinese, the Russians, the Cubans, they all wanted to export the revolution. Invariably, they ended up with dead end. Whether it was Napoleon in Waterloo, the Soviet Union disintegrated, whether it was in Afghanistan or elsewhere, the Chinese completely gave up the idea. Iranian also, the Shi'i Islam, that is a particular brand of Islam that Iran is the leading Shi'i Muslim country. They really, from the very beginning, said they reject nationalism and national boundaries. When we listen to the vocabulary of the clerical characters who actually ended up dominating this revolution, which was originally supported by middle-class, educated, very secular-oriented people, but as it went on, it attracted the urban poor and later on the countryside, and the clerical elements with very fanatical ideological position were able to take over. In order to understand what is happening in the Middle East, we have to keep in mind two very historic events that nobody knows exactly where they will end up. One is that in every Middle Eastern country, the population has doubled. Iran, 35 years ago, had 35 million people. Today, we have close to 80 million. Egypt has 85 million. Every country in the Middle East. And 75% of the people in these countries are under 30, 35 years old. So young population, and at the same time that this incredible expansion of population, largely due to improvement of public health, infant mortality has declined significantly and life expectancy has gone up and the population has dramatically expanded. At the same time, there is this rural-urban movement. I remember as a high school student in the 50s, 85% of Iranian people were living. Iran had 15 million people in 53, 54. 15 million. 80% of them were living in the countryside. About 20% were in the... Tehran had 500,000 people. Today, Tehran has over 13 million people. So at the same time that the population has doubled, this urban-rural migration has also created a massive urban-poor population. Alienated, disconnected from its own tradition, and in the midst of these incredible developments internally, we have globalization, we have social media. Every villager in any part of the Middle East knows what is going on in the rest of the world. The television can say if you live in any Middle Eastern country, you have access to more than 100 television channels. And if you're young and you know what to do with the computer and the internet, and you could imagine. So expectations have gone up. Consciousness has changed. And on a mass level, at the same time that the population has doubled, the population has become young, and these urban-rural areas, this scenario, this scene that I'm describing, it lends itself to fanatical mass politics. To fanatical mass politics. So this is the base that definitely the Islamists have appealed to. It doesn't mean the majority, but definitely significant sectors of the population, and particularly at the same time when religion becomes an ideology. An ideology means that the promise of the heaven and having the absolute truth about past, present, and future. Fundamentalism, whether it's in Georgia or in Tehran or in Cairo, it has one characteristic. Instead of normal human consciousness means remembering the past and imagining the future. They reverse this. They imagine the past and remember the future. And that's what fundamentally the fanatical idea, whether it's whether they do it in evangelicals in the Western world or the fanatical elements, the vocabulary is different, the metaphors are different, but fundamentally this perception. So in that kind of situation, I would say the only country where this ideology has been tested is Iran. So long as the ideology appeals to religious sensibilities, to God and Prophet, and given the history of Islam and all that, and given the urban poor, given the poverty, given the concentration of the people in urban poor areas in the cities and all that, it appeals to them as an ideology, as a promise. The only country where it became the ideology of the state, and it was supposed to create the heaven, is in Iran. So I would say, ironically, 35 years ago, anti-Americanism was a mobilizing force in Iran, and in fact the clerics used anti-Americanism in order to eliminate the liberals, the moderates, the leftists, all the secular forces. And that anti-Americanism was very pervasive. Why? Because the United States had close association with the Shah. The United States was instrumental in overthrowing a democratic elected government in Iran in 1953. That was the historical consciousness of Iranians at the time. That the clerics, ironically, some of the people who came to power after the revolution, they also benefited from the coup in 1953 because Mossadegh was a secular, liberal individual, and they despised his socio-cultural policies, including Ayatollah Khomeini himself. But that's the irony of history. In Iran today, I would say if there is one country, that survey research shows in the Middle East that the population is very sympathetic to the United States. The population dreams of having normal relationship with the United States. It is Iran. Because it is in Iran that this new ideology moved from being a promising idea to the policies of the state, and the results are disastrous with respect to distribution of wealth, with respect to poverty, with respect to drug addiction, with respect to criminal. In every sense of the word, the ideology has failed exactly in the same sense that communism failed in China and in the Soviet Union. Before the communist revolution in the creation of the Soviet Union, the ideology was very attractive. The ideology was very popular. Many intellectuals, educated people all over the world were attracted to the ideology. Because when you read it in the book, the appeal is there. But in reality, it had very little connection to human nature, to the realities of what is possible. So it was only the dead end in those countries that all over the developing countries, whether in Latin America, Africa, Middle East, and elsewhere, communism, or at least the model that had been created and claimed to create an egalitarian society that used to inspire many people, that is dead. And then, in the absence of that, at least in the Middle East today, I would say Islamism, it's a new word. When I studied Middle Eastern history, Islam, and all that, all my undergraduate and graduate work in the United States, I had never seen the word Islamist or Islamism. Because if Islam was not an ideology, Islam was faith. Islam was a religion. Like other human beings, they were committed to the religious perspective. Or where I grew up, in a Muslim community, in a Muslim family and all that, the idea of imposing it on others, and if you didn't believe in it, it didn't really, at least within the middle class and all that, it didn't matter. Now, so that's another motive, that there is the gap between the regime and the sentiments of the public is so deep and so massive that that's really another reason to be hopeful for a negotiated settlement. So, in other words, this export of the revolution in Iran is reaching exactly the same dead end with disastrous results for the Iranian society, I would say for disastrous results for the regime itself, as it did in Cuba, in China, and in the Soviet Union, just the other three revolutions of the 20th century. And perhaps the first generation of leaders, revolutionary leaders, it's 34, 35 years after the revolution. They're all in their 70s and 80s. Once they leave the scene, we are going to have a very new generation of people. So Ayatollah Khomeini or other people like him, they will not change, but they will go to heaven or hell or somewhere in between sooner or later, or they will become dust. But the next generation, they're dealing with a very different kind of reality. Not unlike, not that the ideology is different, the culture is different, but in a historical sense, the expectations and imagination of what they could create when they were fighting against the established order was a very different story than the challenges and the difficulties they faced in the position of power. So what we need to do is today, I have the last one I want to show you is actually a cartoon. I got it from New York Times. Rouhani and President Obama, it says Rouhani is referring to President Obama as a small Satan, as distinguished from the big Satan. And then Obama is referring to Rouhani as axis of not so evil. That it may well be, it's remained maybe that as an incurable optimist. I'm hoping that the realities of their performance in Iran has gradually pushed the state to change its ways. But the United States has to be patient. And it's really a very painful to see people in Congress to try to prevent the continuation of the discussion, and they want to impose new sanctions, and all that. There are some people in the United States who really don't want to see an end to this conflict. There are some people in Iran who don't want to see an end to this conflict for a variety of ideological reasons. Distrust of vengefulness toward Iran, and on the part of Iranian fanatical, absurd ambition they have regionally and internationally. But I would say this interim agreement could pave the way. We cannot be certain, but over the next 6 months, the reports of International Atomic Energy Agency, the reports of American intelligence and European intelligence agencies will clearly show if Iran is actually living up to its commitments. And if it is completely living up to its commitments and satisfying the concerns of the P5+1, it means that the agreement, this interim agreement, not only can lead to a comprehensive agreement to put an end to threat of Iran's nuclear program becoming a military program, but also perhaps a movement toward normalization of US-Iran relationships. And this normalization can provide the kind of security that many Iranian rulers, maybe in 5 years or 10 years, once they feel more secure, the need for a deterrent weapon, that is, the nuclear weapon, will significantly diminish. So I'm personally hopeful that this interim agreement is a path toward rationality. Thank you very much. I will be happy to respond to comments or questions. Please.
I wanted to ask whether you could say a few words about how much flexibility Rouhani has. How much control does Khamenei and the regime, the religious regime, have over him? How much negotiating can he actually do with the United States? And in fact, who is speaking for Iran in this negotiation?
Khamenei is very much involved in everything that has happened, even though in his speeches, because he has a different for 34 years, for 35 years, he has been using anti-Americanism in order to be where he is. So he is not going to change his position overall, but we have to watch what he does. Rouhani is a man coming from the security and intelligence apparatus of the state. He is very close to Khamenei, even though his understanding of the world is much more sophisticated than Khamenei. But he was Khamenei's representative in Iranian National Security Council for many years. So I see the decision that they are playing it in such a way that if it fails, or the radical elements within the country who are critical of it, he wants to play it both ways. But nothing can happen in the negotiations without approval of Khamenei. And he does it because they're faced with serious inflation in Iran is 40%. Iran is a rentier state. If it cannot export oil, it will have very difficulty to manage the affairs of the state. Unemployment is about 30%. So the country is faced with serious economic problems, and these problems are the result of sanctions supported by international community. So Khamenei is pursuing his interest. But at the same time, the United States, another war in Iran could have disastrous, unpredictable consequences. Iran is a large country, a country of 80 million people. Bombing Iran, bombing the facilities, the know-how is still there, the scientists are still there. If Iran is militarily attacked, Iran will immediately withdraw from Non-Proliferation Treaty. There will be no inspection inside the country, and then they could restart the program. In 2 years later, I remember reading in President Eisenhower's memoir that in the 1950s, when the Chinese were moving toward having nuclear weapon, a general had suggested to President Eisenhower that we should bomb their facilities. And Eisenhower says, what if they rebuild it? He says, we have to bomb them again. And then the knowledge is there, the scientists are there, the resources are there, the technology are there. There is no way to bombing them. And invading Iran, it means sending 1 million American troops in a completely hypothetical sense. So the military, when we look at the present, we have to evaluate this agreement and the hope for a comprehensive settlement in comparison with alternatives. People who are rejecting diplomacy, they're really asking for war, and war is not going to solve this problem or advance American interest in the region. Iran is pursuing its interests. In my opinion, 63% of American people, they are sick and tired of war, and they are supporting the diplomatic option Obama is pursuing. So what I see is convergence of interest between the Obama administration and the Iranian regime on the nuclear issue. There is no way to be absolutely certain where it will go, but it's not that one faction is working against the other. Factional politics in Iran has turned this issue into an instrument of one-upmanship in competing with each other. Remember what I said about undemocratic but competitive elections. And that has implications for positions, for privilege, for access to resources, control of international trade, and all that. So factions are competing with each other, and some factions take a more radical and uncompromising position in order to weaken and discredit their competitors, but they represent, in terms of public interest, they represent the tiny, tiny sectors of the Iranian, overwhelming majority of Iranian people want a settlement and want normalization of relation with the United States, and they are having an impact on the policy making. So your question is quite accurate and very important, that that it's not that one faction is doing it and has limited power. Do you know the negotiations began before Rouhani was elected? It began last March in Oman. Sultan Qaboos of Oman was the mediator. They had met in Oman twice. And then when Rouhani came and he brought in a new team, and the new team, they're well versed in their international understanding of international issues and all that, it gained momentum. But the support for it comes from the very top of the political hierarchy. Please.
I'd like to ask a corollary to this gentleman's question. You spoke about the people of Iran having interest in being friends with the United States, but what do the clerics of Iran say? If Iran is a theology, it seems to me that they would be more attuned to what their clerics said.
Well, in the beginning, the clerics genuinely believed, like other fanatical, ideological believers, regardless of whether they're Jews, Christians, Muslim, atheists, communists, it doesn't matter. They really genuinely believed that if they control the elementary school, if they control the propaganda apparatus of the state, if they control the entertainment industry, on and on and on, they will be able to create the new man. Exactly this is what Lenin also wanted to do. That they thought the country, the people are corrupted through Western influence, modern influence, but there is also the exact opposite. Iran today is more secular than ever before, and the young people are more resentful of fanaticism than ever before. So the clerics, unlike what they thought they would be doing in the beginning, they're gradually becoming more and more opportunistic. They're becoming interested in wealth. We have a new governing class in Iran. We have a new ownership class in Iran. These are the people who started with pennies. So Iran has gone through change, and therefore the clerical characters who were ideological fanatics today are political and economic opportunists for the most part. There was a scandal in Iran, $13 billion were missing. Believe it, $13 billion. And two people who had fled the country, they were accused of stealing the money. But in reality, they must have been connected with a host of other people. So the clerics definitely, if we listen to them, if we listen to their propaganda, they are against Western devil, great Satan, and all that. And yet they are fully aware that their propaganda and their advocacy has been very counterproductive within the country, because when you're a preacher and you advocate certain ideas without having any power, you can be attractive to certain sectors of the population. But when you're in the position of power, then it is not your rhetoric that is going to influence what people think about you, but your action and your behavior. And the results of what the Iranian regime has done over the past 34 years have completely eliminated their credibility and their legitimacy for, I think, overwhelming majority of Iranian people in general and the educated people in particular. Iran is not, let me give you one specific example. Islam in general and the clerics in particular have a problem with women. Religion in general, from time immemorial, the suffragist movement in this country, a lot of religious people were opposed to it. Religion is a double-edged sword. It's on both sides, even today. From the very beginning, on the abolitionist movement, it was on both sides. Suffragist movement on both sides. Civil rights movement on both sides. Gender equality movement on both sides. Today, on sexual equality movement on both sides. As Shakespeare said, the devil himself can quote the scripture to make a case for himself. And the Muslims are second to none in doing that because of the early period of Islam. So today, they wanted to prevent advancement of women in Iran, but in fact their actions became exactly the reverse of what they expected. Today we have close to 4 million university students in Iran. 63% of them are women, and they're in every field. And it's very fascinating that an anthropology student at Harvard did a study, did her dissertation. She went to Iran and interviewed 400 female university students, wanted to know on what basis they continue to score high in entrance examination to the universities. And she interviewed 400 people individually. And the article she published, and I would say the dissertation will eventually be published as a book, was that the young woman said this was the best way to get away from the limited environment of the home and the community, go to the university in a major city and town. And that incentive motivated them to study harder and to make it. So, and I can go on and on. For example, music is sacrilegious. Underground music in Iran has a major industry. Over the past 35 years, over 3 million Iranians have left the country. Iran is leading every country of the world in brain drain. Because of not only because of political autocracy in the country, but cultural sophistication of a theocracy in the modern times, in the age of information revolution, and all that. So the clerics might say a lot of things, but their social base is shrinking and their credibility is reaching bankruptcy.
Thank you.
You described very ably the internal threats to the regime. Could you talk a bit about the Iranian borders and neighbors? Are there any real threats now that Saddam expansions policies have evaporated? Are there any real threats?
No, there is no there is no military. In fact, Iran is a military threat. Iran is an ideological threat. Because in the Persian Gulf, Arab states of the Persian Gulf, you have in Saudi Arabia about, I would say, anywhere from 7 to 8% of the people are Shia Muslims. And they're concentrated in the eastern part of the oil-rich areas of the country. In Bahrain, a country with about 700,000 people altogether, Shias constitute the majority. You go to Kuwait, again, a minority. So Iran has been infiltrating and assisting these Shias. And the reason that Iran has been successful in influencing these groups, because these groups were discriminated against. They were marginalized. They were not treated as equal citizens. Sunnis and Shiis go back to 17th, 16th, and 17th century and think about Protestant Catholic confrontation, you get a sense of what we are talking about today. So in that sense, Iran is a threat, and that's why Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, these countries are very concerned that if there is rapprochement between Iran and the United States, they don't want Iran's position in the region to be more respected. They want to make sure that Iran's capacity to influence these minorities. And another thing that Iran has been doing with respect to Israel, in the sense that the vast majority of the people in the Middle East region see Israel as an expansionist state. For even the United States does. No, the United States doesn't recognize Israeli occupation of the West Bank or the Golden Heights. And expanding. And if you go, I remember being on the West Bank and talking to Israeli settlers, they say, we are pursuing the biblical land of Israel. And then they quote the Old Testament, the biblical land of Israel is from Nile to Euphrates. It's an absurdity to say that this is overwhelming majority of Israelis will laugh at that. But when you talk to the settlers who have their own propaganda machine, they frighten other people. Iran opportunistically and cleverly uses anti-Israeli propaganda in order to mobilize the Arab public to support it. And other countries, Egypt doesn't want to do that. Egypt has a peace treaty with Israel. Jordan has a peace treaty with Israel. Saudi Arabia does not engage in that kind of propaganda against it. It's a close ally of the United States. Saudi Arabia is probably more afraid of Iran than Israel. Syria is in a mess, at war with itself. So Iran is one stable country with resources and a propaganda machine that is constantly engaging in anti-Israeli sick propaganda, that the consequences can threaten the Israelis. Obviously, for a people who have a history of 2,000 years of discrimination, exclusion, the Holocaust experience, and some idiot from Iran says, I want to wipe you out from the map, obviously they're going to be, But Iran uses, not because it has the capacity to do anything against Israel, but it uses that propaganda in order to mobilize the Arab street against their own governments, that it is revolutionary Iran that is defending the rights of the Palestinians, and not the Arab governments. This issue, if there is going to be rapprochement and normalization of relations between Iran and the United States, Iran must significantly diminish or put an end to its anti-Israeli propaganda, which is day and night, which has produced what the concerns of Israelis is completely understandable, if not in reality, at least psychologically.
So the borders to the north and to the east are, you never hear of any...
No, Iran has decent relationship with Afghanistan. The only concern Iranians have with respect to Afghanistan, if the United States troops continue to remain in Afghanistan, and they have a military base, where they want to have it is very close to the Iranian border, that would concern them. That's why they're putting so much pressure on Karzai to reject the idea of giving extraterritoriality to the United States and establishment of American. And that's exactly, the Iranians were influential in preventing for giving the United States the right to extraterritoriality in Iraq, because the Shi'is, certain sectors of the Iraqi Shi'is are very close to Iran. Not all, not of course the Sunnis or the Kurds. So Iran has had influence in the, so in other words, two enemies that Iran was deeply concerned with in its foreign policy, they were eliminated by the instructions of God as given to George Bush. Right. And so Iran became much more arrogant, ideologically and in terms of its assist. So when you look at the map in Iran, Iraq, Syria, southern Lebanon, that's why Iran has invested so much in Syria. It's not, when you say, what is the payoff for Iranian security, welfare, or prestige with respect to over $10 billion worth of military and economic aid Iran has given this abominable regime in Syria? Absolutely nothing except the ideological and the ambition of the regime. And I think it has already become a dead end for Iran. Iran is pouring more resources, more assistance, and the end, what is Iran is getting from them? Because Syria is no longer the country, regardless of who rules it, it's already fragmented into various parts and other. So, and even in Iraq, the idea of influencing us, Iraqis in the beginning needed Iran. Iran, the only Shi'i country, was willing economically, politically, and security-wise to assist Maliki government, because Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Egypt, Jordan, all of these countries didn't want the Shi'is of Iraq to become dominant. As we are watching a civil war in Iraq today, every single day. And Iran was the only country assisting them. But this assistance is creating more fragmentation and violence in Iraq. It's not producing any kind of order and stability. And it will never produce order and stability unless the Shi'is and Sunnis come to the realization that this religious war is not going to serve anybody, and coexistence is the only answer to religious differences in any society, as the Western world learned it after, Hobbes told us life is short, brutish, and nasty. He was referring to the Civil War in Great Britain and the 30 years of warfare and devastation in Europe. Something of that nature is threatening the Middle Eastern countries today. And Iran has a major responsibility for starting and promoting this kind of confrontation. That if American pressure, if movement toward normalization could force Iran or persuade Iran to withdraw from this Shi'i-Sunni confrontation, it would be a major contribution to the stability of the region. Okay, one more question. Please.
On your previous slide, you listed the agreements that Iran was obligated to uphold in this new accord.
Right.
But also, it's an agreement that Iran had a number of issues that the United States is responsible to also observe. And already in the U.S. Congress, Democrats and Republicans are trying to change the sanctions, change the agreements that the United States has already agreed to.
Right.
In that.
Well, I've been following it, unfortunately.
Is that going to be, and if the U.S. torpedoes the agreements, when would we ever get another chance to have a peaceful settlement?
It would be a disaster because it serves absolutely no purpose. And I think the article published today by David Cohen should really persuade. Part of it has to do with the fact that some members of Congress, regardless of what Obama does, they criticize him and they reject him. Even if, Mother Teresa came back to life and Obama invited her to dinner, they say, oh, Obama invited her because he wants to convert her to Islam. So that's part of the opposition is coming from a group of people who categorically and unconditionally oppose anything Obama said. There are others who have genuine, real concern, and that those concerns, so does the administration, and as well as European countries, that let's wait and see if every decision made, every commitment made by the United States and Iran, they're reversible. If in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, inspectors of Atomic Energy Agency went there and said Iran is not living up to its obligation, the agreements and the commitments could be reversed. The motives of the people who are causing trouble for this agreement are very similar to the motives of the radical, fanatical elements in Tehran. Right-wing people usually across borders help each other by taking radical position, and then the right-wing people in the other country use that radical hardline position to say this is the real position of the other country in order to discredit the moderates in their societies. That's Congressman Duncan from San Diego 3 days ago. He said we should drop a nuclear bomb on Iran. That's exactly what he said. He said this. So I think there is enough rationality in the Senate to prevent that. The concerns are understandable, but if they wait for 6 months, or if they wait for the reports of International Atomic Energy Agency before they want to expand to increase sanctions, that's understandable. But trying to do it now at a time, you see both sides, they use a classic diplomatic game of there is an agreement, each side goes home and begins to interpret the agreement in order to satisfy certain sectors of its constituency. That's what Iranians are doing to some extent. So I think Kerry is going to persuade them that this is no time to increase sanctions on Iran because it has absolutely no tangible and positive results whatsoever. Thank you so much. Democracy, when you live in an undemocratic, autocratic society, as I did for the first 22 years of my life, you end up romanticizing and idealizing, democracy. But when you live in a democratic society and watch, particularly you get in your senior age, as I am, the shenanigans of democratic politics, you begin to appreciate what Winston Churchill said about democracy, when he said, democracy is the worst form of government except for all those other forms that have been tried against it. Thank you.